Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. If you listen to my podcast, you know that I love the work of William Lane Craig, who is a well-known Christian apologist, philosopher, systematic theologian. I think he's great. I recommend his works all the time, reasonablefaith.org, and read his books. It's just great. People often ask me when I talk about Craig, or people ask me to send me text or messages, or emails, whatnot, and say, "Have you heard of Craig?" Oh, yeah, I do. Or have you listened to his Bible stuff? He does a Sunday school class where he covers the biblical text, and then what do I think about it? And I always feel a little badly. Well, I always do, because I respect him and his work so much. I mean, I just really do. I am thoroughly glad that he is the world's, easy to say, the leading apologist out there. I think he does a fantastic job on many, many, many fronts. I mean, I could go spend a long time with why he does such a great job. And not only is he a genius and brilliant and educated, he also he's a Christian, and he's deliberate about his faith, and he's also a kind, loving person when these atheists and skeptics are very hateful. I mean, he just sets a great example for all of us. He does a fantastic job. I mean, other Christians, not necessarily apologists, because I don't at all consider myself an apologist. But he sets a great example for them as well. And I really mean that. I really mean it, of course. And so he does a fantastic job. But when I answer the question, when people ask me what do you think about it, I always go, I am not a philosopher by training. And he is. And so he's taught me a lot about philosophy, that's for sure. Many philosophers have taught me a lot about philosophy. He's one of them. When it comes to biblical studies, that's more my bailiwick. And when I listen to his Bible classes, there's so many times that I concur with him, or I think he's accurately represented scholars' view. But there are several times where I go, yeah, but, and I want to give you an example of the yeah, but. And I struggle doing this podcast, because I respect him so much and his work so much. It's, he's an easy target if people disagree with him and say, he's this. I'm not at all trying to be that guy. I'm not that guy, or that person, rather, who's trying to pinpoint and pick on him. I just thought really maybe it's a podcast worth reflecting on, just because it's just a different way to interpret the Bible. Maybe, just like an educational, a pedagogical approach to this, as I hope my podcasts always are. They're just more educational than they are to be combative. I actually don't like people who are combative. I don't like that behavior, and I try to not be that myself. So there's so many times that I find myself agreeing with Craig, and there are times I just kind of go, that's not, well, maybe, but that's okay. It doesn't mean it's all bad or all wrong, and none of that. Really, and I still recommend people listen to his stuff. It's just that it's just not exact field of his, and so, but there are a lot of times you can tell. And my goodness, he can't be omniscient. So I'm not picking on him ever, anyway. So he wrote a book. He's written, I think, over 40 books, which is amazing. Just amazing. His most recent book is a short version of a book. He's going to write a fuller treatment of it. And the book is called The Atonement. And it's from a series, Elements in the Philosophy of Religion. The Atonement, at the time of this podcast, just came out. And I downloaded a sample of it. I'm interested to read it, and I was interested in reading it, but I had qualms right off the bat. One is because I know I've heard him in many, many podcasts and presentations and Q&As and whatnot. When he talks about the atonement, there are times where I guess for me, I become a bit uninterested. And disinterested is different from uninterested. I find uninterested is when I'm against it. I'm like, I'm not really interested in that at all. But that when it comes to biblical stuff, when a philosopher writes it, I find myself a bit uninterested, because typically, and Craig, it seems to me, is a great example of this, and that is, when a trained philosopher reads the Bible, they read it from a constant philosophical perspective. That is to say, they see it through the lens of a philosopher all the time. I'm not inherently against that, as if a human being can't have his own view. I have my own view. I get all that. But what I find unpersuasive about that, what makes it interesting to me inherently when a philosopher reads it, and I'll give you other examples in a second, is that the biblical texts were not written by philosophers. Obviously, and I know Craig would know that. I know he knows that. What I'm saying is, what it means, though, automatically, I think that when they read the text, they're coming at it with a particular viewpoint that the biblical authors did not have. My own view is, I don't want to come to the text with any preconceived notions, overt agendas. I have preconceived notions. I read language. I'm a person who's rational, and I have all my history and background, and I'm a man. I mean, I get all that. All I'm saying is I don't come overtly with agenda as if it's got to be philosophically sophisticated or and so forth. I don't come to the text as a Calvinist or come to the text trying to prove Calvinism is false. I don't come to the text as a dispensationalist, because I'm not a dispensationalist. People who, anyway, if you don't know what that term is, sorry. But anyway, I don't come to the text with these agendas and try to make them fit. I try personally, and you can have your own view, of course. Personally, what I try to do is try to read every ancient text within its ancient historical literary context. I want that biblical authors or editors to speak for themselves. Or to say it in a way that I do all the time is I want to time travel. And I want to time travel back then and say, now explain to me what you think. And as best as I can, I want to understand what they think. Period. Step 2 is, now what do I do with it? But step 1 is really, what did you think? I don't care a priori, that is before I even go to the text. I don't care if it's going to make sense to me. I don't care if it fits my modern conceptions. I don't care if it makes me happy. I don't care if it makes me sad or depressed. I don't care what effect it's going to have on me. I go to the text going to know, what did you say? What did you mean when you use those words? And for me, I do that because I respect the text so much. I want to know what they meant when they said it. So I don't go to the text with any kind of preconceived notions. Overtly, consciously, I don't. I'm sure I've got subconscious agendas that I don't know, but they're subconscious and I can't control them. But what Craig and many others like him, in my experience, have done when they read the text, that's what they do. And I'm not, fussing at them. It just means I'm immediately going, I don't really care too much what you have to say. Here's another example of Jordan Peterson, who's well known, of course. He's not as popular these days at the time of this recording. He was, everything is like a fad, but he's still out there, and he's still on YouTube and still doing interviews and whatnot. But he's given a lot of interviews and talks and whatnot, and I've done at least one podcast to him before. While he is not a philosopher, his train is psychology, and he specializes in one particular kind of psychology. And so when he reads the Bible as well, he brings all that to bear. And so he's constantly interpreting the text from that particular psychological background. Again, to repeat myself, can he do that? Sure he can. He's a free old individual. I mean, great. Are there benefits or fruit to reading it from a particular perspective? Maybe so. Maybe so. Philosophers can help us think things through. Psychologists can help us think things through and apply it. I'm not inherently against that. But when it comes to the biblical text, at the end of the day, beginning of the day and end of the day, I'll keep saying, yeah, but I want to know what they said. I don't want you to come to the text and read it as a blank, as a poet, as a chef, as a blank. I don't want you to come just read it in the ancient context. So we need to know what they thought back then, how they used language back then, what these ancient contexts were back then. That's my chief concern. So when Craig wrote a book on Atonement, I've read several of the books he's written, I found this to be the case, including when he does his classes. So he has some really good material, and there are times I go, whoa, no. Or he'll say, that scholar is dead wrong because that scholar has failed to take in consideration the philosophical And I'm like, whoa, that scholar wasn't trying to be philosophically savvy. That scholar was trying to represent what the text meant to the ancient audience. It doesn't matter if it's philosophically sophisticated to you. What matters is what they meant back then. And I find myself doing that a lot when I listen to his talks. Not all the time, but that's one thing. So when it came to Atonement, the other thing, that's my first major thing. I was, I'm not sure if I want to read the book on the Atonement, because there's probably going to be a lot of it's almost like a philosopher reads the Bible. And that doesn't mean, again, there's no benefit, but that's my first concern. My second major concern is, in the interviews I've heard him do on this particular book, and that is he deliberately wanted to write a book defending a particular view of the atonement, penal substitution. Penal substitution basically is the idea that Christ's death is substituted for our death. He bears the punishment, that makes it penal, on our behalf. And in Craig's view, there's a lot of people who caricature that view, and so they renounce it, and denounce it, but they're denouncing something that's not real. And he also thinks that a lot of the early church fathers are also misread, and he's also very convinced that modern philosophers simply don't know what to do with it, and they don't do a good job, they don't present the biblical text well, and so forth. And those charges might all be true. What my second point right now I'm only making is, what made me concerned is, why would someone go out of their way to make sure they defend a doctrine? And again, that when you do that, again, that's back to the agenda. You go back and say, I want to defend this case. Now, he might say, David, I want to defend this agenda to do that because it is the biblical way. But, okay, and he might say that in the book, but he might. But immediately I think is, well, then the answer is, I'm not going to persuade about that because I don't think there is a biblical view. And so if someone's to defend a view and say it is the view, well, that's different. If you said it's a view, that's different than saying it's the view. And again, in the book, he might say penal substitution is just one of many. But in my interviews, if I understand him correctly, it's not true. I think he sees it more as the view. It's a Protestant understanding of the penal substitution is the view we're supposed to have, and the chief understanding of the death of Jesus. And immediately I go again. So the first is I'm cautious because the philosopher goes to the text with an overt agenda. My second major point is if you say that this is a view is the view, immediately I'm just unpersuasive. Why would you do that? Why go in trying to defend it? Why not try to present what the biblical text actually says and let that be enough? And that's my second major concern. So on those two issues aside, I downloaded a sample, and that's all I've read so far, and I've read the introduction, and it wasn't but a few pages into it on my Kindle that I started going, see, this is what I'm talking about, this is what I'm talking about. And so these are things where, I don't know, I guess I'm hunahana because I'm hopefully this is helpful when we think about biblical ways to read the text, or how scholars might disagree on a subject. It's not just to pinpoint and make fun or just to cause argument. It's really not. It's just what we do when we think about things. And he would do the same thing if he reads my books and say, David has not been philosophically sophisticated or whatever. And that's fine. That's fine. But there are things like, for example, this is right after his introduction. Well, it's in his introduction. He just starts off the introduction. And he's not far into it at all. I can't say a page because I'm on Kindle, but I'm on. And early on he says, he's talking about in Middle English, the word atonement comes from Middle English term, at-one-ment. And he talks about the closest New Testament word for atonement in this sense is katalegi, or reconciliation, specifically reconciliation between God and man. And that's true. That is what the Greek term means. Now, it can be used reconciliation between people and people, but it's true. That is the term, the Greek term. Then he says this, quote, reconciliation is the overarching theme of the New Testament. Now, pause there. As soon as you said that, I went, whoa, come on now. This is where New Testament scholarship, whenever you make the argument it is the overarching theme, that's a big one. I expect the next several pages or chapters to argue that point. Because in New Testament scholarship, we rarely ever say things like something is the view. I mean, you'd really have to make a case for that. He doesn't at all. There's not even a footnote. It's just, it is the overarching theme of the New Testament, period. And then, it's the first opening phrase of a sentence. So reconciliation is the overarching theme of the New Testament, and other important New Testament motifs such as the kingdom of God, salvation, justification, and redemption are subservient to it. Atonement in this sense thus lies at the heart of the Christian faith. Now, again, that's okay, but man, you need to argue that. I mean, New Testament people argue this all the time. There are people who argue the kingdom of God is, if there is a overarching theme in the New Testament, it is God establishing the kingdom of God on earth. Some might just say Jesus, and some people call him the Messiah event. That is his coming, death, and resurrection. It's just a huge topic, and he didn't have a footnote. And that kind of stuff makes you go, come on, Bill. I don't know him. Come on, brother. At least put a footnote that says, I acknowledge that what I'm saying here is quite controversial, and instead just moves on as if every New Testament scholar agrees with him. This is just the way it is. And then he goes on about the Hebrew. In the Old Testament, atonement is kippur, like Yom Kippur, to purify or to cleanse, and he uses the Greek equivalent, heleskathe, which is correct. Another thing that's interesting too. Well, anyway, I won't do that's a very nerdy thing. Anyway, so that's fine. And then he goes on. He says this: the message of the New Testament is that God, out of His great love, has provided the means of atonement for sin through Christ's death. And he quotes John 3:16. So he says the message of the New Testament is that God, out of His great, again, that's the own things. And then you quote John 3:16. That's what you never, ever, ever do in the New Testament. In New Testament scholarship, you never say, this is the view of the New Testament, and then cite a Bible verse. If you were in class, you'd get It depends on what school you went to. You might get fussed at, but you don't do that. You never say, this is the view of the Bible, and then cite one Bible verse. If you say something is a theme or something like that, even then you have to cite multiple verses to demonstrate it is in fact the theme. Because when you say this is the message of the New Testament, and you quote John 3:16, it is absolutely unpersuasive. What he should have said is, I think the message of the New Testament is this, and I think John 3:16 encapsulates this view. And that's fine. You can have his opinion, but that's not what John 3:16 is not the New Testament. When John wrote John 3:16, John wasn't thinking he's writing the theme of the New Testament, or the message of the New Testament, rather. That's not, because when John wrote John, there was no New Testament. So those kind of things you just can't say. That's not persuasive. When you use Bible verses are supposed to be the evidence for the case you're making. And the way around that is, if you say, for example, you would put in parentheses, you would put e.g. Have you ever seen this before, right? And whatnot. And anyway, exemplia gratia. It's in Greek, exemplia gratia. We say, like, for example. So e.g. is for example, and then that's what all you had to do is for example. Anyway, so it's those nuances. And then he says, so David, what does that mean? You don't think God out of his great love has done that? No, I do think he has done that. I'm saying it is not the message of the New Testament. Well, it's arguably not the message of the New Testament, but maybe it is. But citing one verse does not make your case. Not at all. And then he goes on to say, a little later on, he's talking about the cross. The cross, or the word of the cross, becomes a very important point. He says, so the four Gospels devote disproportionate space to the Jesus' so-called passion, the final week of his suffering and crucifixion, thereby emphasizing his death. I'm going to pause there. That's well known in the Gospels. It's a very, very, well, people give one guy credit for it, but he didn't say it. I don't want to get too nerdy, but it really is, the Gospels, particularly Mark's Gospel, is disproportionate. But if you read Matthew, Luke, and John, it's not that disproportionate. It's really in Gospel of Mark where it's more disproportionate than all the other ones. So that's fine. But I guess I'm saying the implication is, because it's disproportionate, it sounds like it's almost nothing but the final week, and that's just not true. That's not true. And then secondly, even if more time is given to the death of Jesus in the narrative, it does not follow from that the cross becomes central to the message of the New Testament. That's not what New Testament scholars think. What New Testament scholars think is that the passion narrative of Jesus, and it does slow down in time. It's because before in his ministry, there's not a lot of time mentioned. It'll be like the next day or something like that. But all of a sudden, when you get to that final week of Jesus, it slows down, almost day, night, morning, and then even crucifixion is by the hour, 3rd hour, 6th hour, 9th hour, whatever. So time really slows down. New Testament scholars, in general, if there is a consensus, is that the reason why that's early on, the reason why it's slowed down in time, is because it's a very, very primitive oral tradition that was passed on in the church. Very, very primitive. That's it. So it doesn't mean that the passion narrative of Jesus, if they have a long, disproportionate more narrative is given to them, it therefore means it's more important in the gospel. Instead, it means that the gospel authors are simply writing down, they are composing what is an oral tradition before them. A fairly established oral tradition that had been passed down by that point. So in the church, that final week was probably repeated many, many, many times. But all that came before it, when the parables and the healings, the exorcism and so forth, particularly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those were not so formulaic. So anyway, so it does matter that there's a disproportionate space, but it does not follow from that. Therefore, the gospel writers think his death is the most important thing. And if that's what he means, or that's even what he's implying, my view is I don't find that persuasive. If that's what he's implying, maybe I've misread him, maybe I misunderstood him. But yes, his death is very important. Yes, of course it is. And there you go. Then he goes on to quote 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, that this early formula from Paul, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, raised on the 3rd day. And he says this is the formula that was dating within 5 years of Jesus' resurrection, and that's almost certainly correct. Almost certainly. We don't know exactly when it was composed, but there's a lot of reasons to think this goes back early. There's a lot of reasons for that. We can't prove it, but it is very likely. And he goes on to say that this message, Paul says, that was proclaimed by all the apostles, it is the message that dominates the New Testament. That dominates the New Testament, that Christ died for our sins, dominates the New Testament. My response is, man, brother, you got to argue that. You got to argue that, because there are a lot of verses in the New Testament, and by far the majority of the other verses don't say Jesus died for our sins. It is when you say it dominates the New Testament, maybe you mean it is a dominant theme, and that's all he has to say to be right. It is a dominant theme when they talk about the death of Jesus. But when you say it dominates the New Testament, it sounds, that's just false. It implies that it's all over the place. It is not all over the place, because the New Testament documents are not all about the death of Jesus. They're about all kinds of other things. And when it's apropos, they talked about the death of Jesus. If I read the Quran and said that Allah is all over the place, or Muhammad's all over the place, it dominates the Quran. That's true. That's true. It dominates the New Testament. If you said God as a being dominates the New Testament, that's true. But anyway, he goes on to talk about the fact of the atonement is different from the theory of the atonement, and that I completely agree with that. He says we should distinguish between the fact of the atonement and the theory of the atonement. He says, a great variety of theories of the atonement have been offered to make sense of the fact that Christ, by his death, has provided the means of reconciliation with God. Competing theories of the atonement need to be assessed by, 1, their accord with biblical teaching, and 2, their philosophical coherence. Unfortunately, the work of contemporary Christian philosophers on the doctrine of the atonement has been largely uninformed by biblical exegesis. Let me pause there and say at least two major things. One is when he says they need to be assessed by their accord with biblical teaching, their philosophical coherence. You already know what I'm going to say about that, probably, which is, no, they don't. No, they don't. Philosophers might care about that. I shouldn't say no, they don't. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Because as Christians, everybody can do what you want. You can say they need to be assessed by what chefs think about them. They need to be assessed by what poets think. They need to be assessed by what scientists. In other words, you can pick any field you want. Craig, being a philosopher, wants to make sure they're philosophically coherent. Oh, okay, that's fine. As a biblicist, I don't care if they're philosophically coherent. I do not care at all. What I care about is if it's accurately representing what an ancient person thought about it. What did Paul mean when he said Christ died for our sins? I don't care if the Apostle Paul was philosophically sophisticated or philosophically coherent. What I care about is what did he say? And then, of course, was it true? Is it true that his understanding of Jesus' death, is that accurate in the ancient world? Or is it bizarre? Is it wrong? To me, that's a historical question and a biblical question, but not if it's philosophically coherent. Then he goes on to say, the work of contemporary Christian philosophers has been largely uninformed by biblical exegesis. On this particular issue, I agree with him completely, and in general, I agree with him. And let me say more about that. It's very, very common in the field. Most people who are not in the field of biblical studies have no idea that and not being mean, they're just ignorant. They don't know what these different fields are. Much like if someone tells me so-and-so's a doctor. Well, there's all kinds of doctors, right? Cardiologists, on and on it goes. Well, that's not my bailiwick. I don't know all the specialists. So if you say this person specializes in a particular kind of artery, I don't know the difference between that person and the person who deals with something else, maybe. I don't know. They can explain it to me, but if you give me the title, the name, I won't be able to use this based on Greek or Latin. I can't do it. Well, in biblical studies, it's the same thing. It just is. So if you talk to the average person, they think everybody who studied the Bible is called a theologian, and that's completely false. It's not. Theology is a particular subdiscipline of the Christian religion. And of all those, and I've done this on the podcast, so I'm not going to spend much time here, but under theology, there's subgroups. Systematic theologians, there's historic theologians, that was my PhD. Systematic theology, I had a lot of systematic theology in my master's and some of my PhD, but particularly my master's. Craig's specialty, his other PhD was in systematic theology. So of course he leans towards things being systematic, having a view of the Bible, the New Testament. And anyway, so you have systematic theological, historical theology, you have makes all constructive theology, and there's all kinds of other theology, black theology, liberation theology, and on and on. A very different field, well, not different like compared to chemistry versus cooking, but I mean, it's a different field, is biblical criticism. Then you have New Testament and Old Testament biblical stuff. Then people specialize in those fields. And then you have people who focus on other things. You have, I mean, I'm going for a long time. But what is my point only here is he's exactly right. A lot of people don't realize this, that you can study and be a theologian, and certainly a Christian philosopher, and make all kinds of theological statements and not know that much about the Bible. That might sound bizarre to you, but it's just, well, it's bizarre to me, and it's in my field. It's bizarre to me. It's true, because I've studied the books. I've read a lot of Christian theologians, and in his text here and other things Craig says oftentimes reminds me of, that's the point. They'll have some, but if you find a Christian theologian who knows a lot of biblical stuff, usually they're called a biblical theologian, and they're a rare bird. Now, Craig himself studied under a guy who was and is well known for that, Wolfhard Pannenberg. He likes his New Testament particularly, and I really appreciate about Pannenberg. But I've read other theologians that barely even talk about it. I've read books on the resurrection that barely reference the New Testament, and they're trying to construct theological ways of understanding the resurrection, but they barely mention the biblical text. They can do that; that's their field. But for me, as a biblicist, that's bizarre. I'm like, how in the world? What? I don't care what you think. I care what Paul thought or Jesus thought, and that's just where we differ. So I just want to say, when Craig says that unfortunately, the work of contemporary Christian philosophers on the doctrine of atonement has been largely uninformed by biblical exegesis. My response is, I bet he's exactly right, because a little bit I've seen, that's exactly right, and that's unfortunate. So I very much applaud Craig's attempt to be biblically savvy, as much as he can. Then he goes on to talk about the biblical data concerning the atonement, and I'm not going to spend too much longer on this. He talks about how in the biblical data concerning the atonement is varied, but he says specifically, our interest in examining the biblical material is not an historical critical analysis of the biblical text. And immediately I went, like, what? What? Come on, Billy. Why would you not want to do that? But then he says, seeking, for example, to determine the date and providence of the priestly traditions concerning the Jewish sacrifices, or to ascertain the authentic words of Jesus concerning his death, but rather with the biblical text as we have it. Now, and that part I understand, but that's not the same as all historical critical analysis, because if you omit the historical critical analysis, then you admit maybe not the dates of the priestly traditions, that's right, but what the words meant in Hebrew and how ancient people understood the concept of sacrifice and atonement and so forth. And so that, I don't know, I almost wish he just said, there are aspects of the historical critical analysis we won't do, but we love the rest of it. But fine, he doesn't, and whatever. Anyway, and he says, in approaching the biblical teaching on the atonement, we must decide whether to approach the subject thematically or by author. While the latter approach has the advantage of giving us a clear picture of what Paul or John, for example, thought about the subject, it does not permit us to develop common emphases. We shall therefore take a thematic approach to the biblical materials. Now, there I want to say is, and this paragraph, therein lies a huge distinction between a systematic theologian and what they attempt to do versus what biblical theologians and biblicists do. If you're a systematician, you're looking for the systematic way to get at it. You're looking for massive themes. And you try to study and present the biblical text in such a way that you're looking for the ways to make it a theme. And so if someone says, what's the Christian view on angels? And you say, here it is. Here's 4 paragraphs on angels, and you cite every single Bible verse there is. Biblical theologians, and certainly biblicists by trade, historians and biblicists, people who studied the historical background of the text themselves, they do not do that. They do not. They treat it atomistically. So they will say, what does Matthew think about angels? What does Mark think about angels? What does Luke think about? What does John? They might bring some strands together, but biblicists don't feel compelled to make sure there is a theme that you can put your one finger on it. Here is the view. Here is the view. You say, no, here's Paul's view. Here's John's view. Here's Jesus' view. And like I said, if they agree, great. They say, well, they agree. Wonderful. If they don't agree, you say, well, they don't agree. I mean, or they're just different or whatever, but they're the biblical text. We don't try to make it fit. something else, you try to make it the biblical text be the biblical text. And so, and that it's not that Craig can't do that. He can. It just means immediately as a biblicist, again, that's maybe the point of this podcast. As a biblicist, I read that and go, I'm already a bit, I don't know, bothered, frustrated, but he can do it. It's his book. They just like, oh man, I wanted to hear because here's why. Paul and John, as examples you give, they might have different views on the subject. In fact, I know they do. It's not radically different, but I want to hear what their views are. I just want to hear what their views are. They're a bit distinct, and I want to hear what Paul's view is, what John's view is, and Mark's view is, and Matthew. First off, I want to hear what their view is. I don't want to hear what Craig thinks the big emphasis should be. I want to hear what they thought. The second thing is, if they do disagree, why do they disagree? Or if they have different nuances, I want to that to come through. I don't want to misunderstand them. Maybe a third thing is, and this is a very common problem, because I'm looking for an emphasis so much, I'm looking for that theme so much, I don't want to make one text really mean something else because it just has to fit. And I'll give you an example here in just 1 second, that in New Testament studies, we don't do that. I mean, you don't. Anyway, and I'll say this last bit because he's going to talk about sacrifices and some other stuff, but he talks about sacrifice. So he says, the predominant motif, and here it is, used in the New Testament to characterize the atonement is the presentation of Christ's death as a sacrificial offering to God on our behalf. Now, I would expect him to have footnotes, to have every single reference, or have a chart or something that says, here's evidence that it is the predominant motif. He doesn't. There's no footnote, there's nothing. He just said it is. Now, he might be right, but if he were in my class and I was a professor, I would say, I would have a big star and a check mark or something saying, these are massive statements you need to defend. And then what he says is, New Testament scholar Joel Green, he's good, provides a pithy summary. Now, what he then cites is Joel Green's comment, and Joel Green's, and I like Joel Green, and immediately I know I'm reading a biblicist because of how he writes what he quotes. I can tell right away. Joel's a biblicist, he's a New Testament scholar, and the quote he gives does not support what Craig just said. Craig's point is that it is the predominant motif. And then he quotes Joel Green talking about, and this is what Joel Green's starts off. Green's quote is this: in their development of the saving significance of Jesus' death, early Christians were heavily influenced by the world of the sacrificial cult in Israel's scriptures and by the practices of animal sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple. The expression Christ died for all, widespread in this and variant forms throughout the New Testament, and he said, for example, and he lists Mark 14:24, Romans 5:6 and 8, 15:3, Galatians 2:21, 1 Peter 3:18. That's what New Testament scholars do. When you say it's widespread, you have to prove it's widespread. And then he says, is thematic in this regard, as are references to the salvific effects of the blood of Christ, and he goes on. So, and then he gives several examples of that vocabulary. That's true. I mean, this is exactly true. It is thematic. But when Craig says it's the predominant motif, and then it quotes that, it gives the impression that Joel Green agrees with him, that the quote in and of itself does not demonstrate Craig's point, that it is the predominant view. It is a predominant view. That's exactly right. But anyway, it is a view. He goes on in the next one, which is Jesus' attitude toward his death. And Jesus' own attitude toward his death, he talks about how Christians think his death matters, it's salvific, but we don't just make it up. Jesus himself had it. And I think in general that's true. He said Jesus predicted his own death. He even did it during the Passover festival as the climax of his ministry. It was no accident. And then he took the bread, he gave it to them, and said, take this in my body, take a cup, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Now right away I knew he's reading Mark's version, Mark 14:22-24. The reason why I know it's Mark's version is because he doesn't say, for the remission of sins, for the forgiveness of sins. And that's very important. In Matthew's version, in Mark's gospel, that John the Baptizer says that. He was preaching a baptism and forgiveness of sins. But in Matthew's gospel, he doesn't want John the Baptizer having anything to do with forgiveness of sins, and so he puts it on the lips of Jesus at the Passover meal. But Mark's gospel doesn't have that. So when he quotes Mark's gospel of the Passover meal and sacrifice, right away I'm thinking, I wonder if Craig, respectfully, knows what he's doing, if he realizes that if he's trying to make the point that Jesus' death was forgiving in some way, he needs to cite a different gospel, not Mark, because that's not Mark's point. And then he says, Jesus saw his death symbolized in the elements of the Passover meal. It was the blood of the Passover lamb smeared on the doorposts of Jewish homes that had saved the Jewish people from God's judgment in Egypt. So again, Jesus saw his death symbolized in the elements of the Passover meal. Well, maybe, Bill, but remember, I shouldn't say remember. Virtually every New Testament scholar agrees that Jesus is not reenacting the Exodus scene. He's not reenacting the Passover lamb meal. He's radically redefining it. He took the bread and gave it and says, "This is my body." He doesn't take the bread and say, "This is the body of the Passover lamb." He says that he gets the cup and he says, "Take it and drink it. This is my blood of the covenant." Jesus does not say, "This is the blood of the Passover lamb smeared on the doorposts of Jewish homes." So in other words, so when he says Jesus saw this death symbolized in the elements of the Passover meal, my response is, maybe, but you really got to defend that. New Testament scholars have said for a long time that he's just radically redefining this. You need to make sure you're saying it. You just got to defend that, and that's a big one. It's a common thing for Christians to say what he just said, Craig said, but he's not been defended. And he goes on to say, moreover, the expression, "This is my blood of the covenant," recalls Moses' words at the inauguration of the Old Covenant. And he cites Exodus 24:8. That's exactly right. Now, hold on a second. This is very important. When he says, moreover, the expression, "This is my blood of the covenant," recalls Moses' word at the inauguration of the Old Covenant, Exodus 24:8. Exodus 24:8 has nothing to do with the Passover. Exodus 24:8 has nothing to do with the Passover. He just said that's what Jesus is doing. But New Testament scholars, particularly Markan specialists, when they look this up, you realize that is exactly what's happening. Jesus is not citing the Passover meal. In fact, what he's doing, he's quoting directly from Exodus 24:8. And what's going on in Exodus 24 is when Moses, he takes, to me it's pretty disgusting, but he does burnt offerings in these young bowls as peace offering. He takes half the blood and he puts in the bowls. He takes the other half, he splashed it on the altar. That's in 24:6. He splashed on the altar because back then, historical critical method, here we go. This is where it helps us. Back then, this blood, it acts like a detergent. It's purifying the altar. So the reason why you get the blood of these animals that have been sacrificed as peace offerings and the burnt offerings is because it's washing off the altar. It's making it ritually pure. He's splashing the altar. That'd have been a real bloody mess. I mean, think how that's not to be European, but I mean, it would have been nasty. It would have smelled gross. But in their world, they're cleaning the altar. Verse 7, 24:7. He took the book of the covenant. He read it aloud to the people, and they said, "We are willing to do and obey all that Yahweh has spoken." So that is, the people are saying, we are making a covenant. So here's what he says in verse 8. So Moses took the blood and splashed it on the people and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that Yahweh has made with you in accordance with all these words." So he splashes blood on the altar to purify it. He splashes blood on the people, probably you might say, to purify them. He's marking out these people. To splash the people with blood is co-identifying them with this session here of a covenant he's making with them. And it is not the Passover meal that's being reenacted, but this new covenant. It's a metaphor. This is the blood of my covenant. This is my blood of the covenant, is a way of Jesus saying, when you eat this bread and drink this drink, eat the bread and drink the drink, I'm making a new covenant with you. I'm not literally spraying you with blood, but when you drink it, it's like that. You're becoming my people. You're becoming my people who are joining a covenant with me, just like in Exodus 24 when those people joined the covenant. So again, that's why historical critical, just reading that alone makes you go, well, Bill, I think you've misread Mark completely. I think Mark's point is amazing. I think the point William Craig is making is okay. It's just, I think it's wrong. It preaches constantly in churches that teach it, but that's not the point that Jesus is making in Mark. So when Bill Craig says, moreover, the expression, "This is my blood of the covenant," it's not moreover. It is the point. It's not moreover. It's not like, and secondly, here's the point he's making. It is the point. And then he says, Bill Craig says, Jesus the Messiah is inaugurating by his death the new covenant prophesied by Jeremiah. And that's Jeremiah 31 to 34, which would bring restoration and forgiveness of sin. Now, of course, Craig is saying Jesus is inaugurating by his death a new covenant prophesied in Jeremiah 31:31. Now, my question, of course, is, why do you think that? Now, it preaches well, and it's very common, and this is this. In Jeremiah 31, it says this. This is Jeremiah, historical critical context, and literary context. Jeremiah is talking to the Jews who are in Babylonian captivity, and they're going to come home. And he says, when they get back, I want to make a new covenant with them, and it's going to be different. It's going to be one where they won't have to read the stone law and then be obedient. I'm going to put it right inside their heart. I'm going to help them. I will inspire them in their heart and mind to want to be obedient. It won't be obligatory because they have to go read the stone and, I got to do this, but rather they will want to do it. They will be interested in following the covenant. Listen to what he says in Jeremiah 31:31. Indeed, a time is coming, says Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and Judah. It will not be like the old covenant that I made with their ancestors when I delivered them from Egypt, for they violated that covenant, even though I was like a faithful husband to them, says Yahweh. But I will make a new covenant with the whole nation of Israel after I plant them back in the land, says Yahweh. I will put my law within them and write it on their hearts and minds. I will be their God and they will be my people. Now, if you go back to what Craig said and go back to what the text says, what Craig says, Jesus the Messiah is inaugurating by his death the new covenant prophesied by Jeremiah, which would bring restoration and forgiveness of sin. My response is, why do you think that? What in Jeremiah 31 and 34 has anything to do with what Jesus said in Mark 14? Again, that preaches well, but nothing in the text says that. Nothing in it says. It just doesn't. Some old translations even had the word, this is my blood of the new covenant, but that's not what's in the Greek. It's not. The best manuscripts we have don't have that. There's nothing in Jeremiah 31 that's being cited or quoted here. You might say, well, it's really in the background. I mean, okay, you can say that, and some people do. You just need to make a case for it. You really make an argument for it. You need to make an argument that what Jesus is saying here is that at the Last Supper meal, I'm making a new covenant where I'm going to put my law in your heart. You need to make that argument. I don't find that persuasive at all. I don't think whatsoever, if I time travel and I'm at that last meal, that's Jesus' point whatsoever. I think Jesus' point is actually the point he made when he quotes the exact text. My blood of the covenant comes Exodus 24, verse 8. Does that make sense? So in a few verses, being clear about what Mark was saying and reading the Old Testament carefully, it changes what Mark's Jesus was making the point. It's just different. It's different. Now, if you want to say, well, Matthew has a different point, fine, we'll bring up Matthew. I mean, that's fine. Just bring up Matthew. But don't say this is the view. And certainly don't say Jesus is saying this or that when you quote Mark. And I wouldn't do that. That's not. And this last thing he says, moreover. So here's another thing, another allusion Craig thinks. Moreover, the words poured out for many. And remember, that's back when Jesus said, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. The words poured out for many hark back to Isaiah's prophecy of the servant of Yahweh, who, and then he quotes Isaiah 53:12. This is also very common for preachers to do this. I'm not saying, therefore, it's always wrong. I'm saying this is a common churchy thing to do, but it's almost always problematic because when you look at the text carefully, it's just not as persuasive. So let's see if Craig's right. Poured out for many. The quote, these words hark back, and here's the quote from Isaiah 53:12. Poured out his soul to death, and was numbered with his transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So there you go. I mean, you might find them persuasive. I don't. Mark's Jesus does not quote anything from Isaiah 53:12. And if you say the words poured or the word many, as long as it has those words, or poured out and many, maybe that's enough for you. Maybe to have, but I don't. But maybe it does for you. It doesn't for me at all. So you would expect if he's quoting from something, or it's a very close allusion, it'd be very, very close, either in the Greek or Hebrew or in some transliteration, and it's not Isaiah 53:12. Again, what Craig's trying to do is make sure that we read Jesus' last words as atoning. Somehow he's offering his life for sin. And I'm saying in Mark's gospel, in Mark 14, Jesus is not presented as a person who's going to die for his sin. That's not the point he's making at the Last Supper. Not in Mark's Gospel. In Mark's Gospel, the Last Supper, it is not about how he's going to forgive sins by his death or be atoning or write a new covenant on their hearts. None of that stuff. Not in Mark's Gospel, it's not. Mark deliberately wants you to think that when he's making this covenant with his disciples, he's making a new covenant. He's joining it. You're my people. If you go with me to death, if you eat this bread and drink this wine, you are co-identifying with my death. And that's making you my people. And then Craig has a bunch of other stuff that's, I think, is not there. Then he goes on to say, Craig does, Jesus saw himself as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, who, quote, makes himself an offering for sin. Isaiah 53:10. My response is, where do you see that? Where does Jesus ever say that he makes himself an offering for sin? And now he's going to tell you why. Not in the Last Supper, though he changed the subject. He said, earlier, Jesus had said of himself, the Son of Man also came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Let me pause there for a second. This ransom for many. Jesus did say that in Mark 10:45. He did. But many New Testament scholars, not all, but many New Testament scholars as well, argue that in Mark 10:45, Jesus is not speaking of sin. The ransom theology in Mark's Gospel is not sin-related, but evil dominance related. That is to say, people are freed, like slaves are freed by ransom. They are freed from the power of evil and sin in the world, in Mark's Gospel. So, had Bill Craig wanted to make the point that Jesus saw himself as a suffering servant in Isaiah 53, he should have chosen other texts. He should have stayed away from Mark, because Mark is one of the worst Gospels he'd have gone to make the point, based on what most Markan specialists would say. So when he goes to Mark 10:45 to say Jesus really thought he was offering himself for sin, my response is, you got to make a case for that, and that's not persuasive to me. It's not. And then he says this last thing: the Son of Man is a divine human figure from Daniel's prophecy. Now, why is Bill Craig talking about the Son of Man? Because he just quoted Mark 10:45. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So then Craig says, the Son of Man is a divine human figure from Daniel's prophecy, whom, quote, all peoples, nations, and languages should serve, Daniel 7:14. That's true, that almost certainly that's where that expression comes from. All peoples, nations, and languages should serve. Now, it's the word serve that Craig is going to tie in together now. Craig says, in this paradoxical statement, Jesus stands things on their head, declaring that the Son of Man has come in the role of a servant, and like the servant of Isaiah 53, gives his life as a ransom for many. So we'll read that one more time. In his paradoxical statement, Jesus stands things on their head, declaring that the Son of Man has come in the role of a servant, and like the servant of Isaiah 53, gives his life as a ransom for many. So what Craig thinks is going on is this. He thinks that in Daniel, when it says that the Son of Man, that all peoples, nations, and language should serve him, that's Daniel 7:14, that Jesus takes that Son of Man and flips it on his head. Because what Jesus says is, I didn't come to be served, but to serve. I didn't come to be served, but to serve. Daniel says people should serve the Son of Man. Jesus says, but not this Son of Man. I'm not going to let anybody serve me. I'm going to serve them. And Craig says that's paradoxical. Okay, this is highly problematic, and he's completely mistaken. And that's because, back to just languages, that I hear what he's saying, he's just completely wrong. And in Daniel 7:14, okay, he's probably completely wrong. I shouldn't say it definitive. He's probably completely wrong. In Daniel 7:14, when it says all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him, the should serve, the Hebrew word for serve there can be translated serve, and that's fine. But if you look up how many times and when and where serve is used in Daniel, it means almost certainly it means something like worship, to worship, or to be worshipped. Now, if you don't believe me, let me I'm not going to read all the Daniel passages if that's okay. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to cite them. It means worshipped in Daniel 3:12, 3:14, 3:18. There's at least 3 verses. You can look those up yourself. There's more of them in Daniel. In other words, every time or almost every single time, I think it's every time, I have to go back and look up every instance. Whenever served is used in Daniel, it fits a common way that ancient Hebrews talked about worshiping a deity, which is to serve their needs. If that's true, and I'm very confident it is, this has nothing to do with Mark 10:45. In Mark 10:45, when Jesus says the Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve, he literally means to be served. Literally. That is to say, I didn't come here to establish a kingdom where I'm literally served on this earth. I've come to give my life as a ransom. In Daniel, when it says all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him, that means to worship him as deity. That's exactly what will happen. So, serve means 2 different things there. That's why this is not related. One is literally serve on earth in his ministry. The other is Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 7 that this Son of Man figure should be worshipped. He should be worshipped. Jesus is not saying the Son of Man has come not to be worshipped, but to worship and to give his life as a ransom for many. No, he means literally served. But that's not what Daniel means. Daniel means to worship. So it's not a paradoxical statement at all. And then he says, like the servant of Isaiah 53, he gives his life as a ransom for many. Well, again, he asserts that, but does not argue that. He asserts Jesus thinks he's the servant of Isaiah 53. I just don't find that persuasive. And then, of course, Craig brings it all together, all of his assertions. Jesus evidently saw his death as a redemptive sacrifice, like the Passover sacrifice, and himself as a sin bearer, inaugurating, like the Mosaic sacrifice, a fresh covenant between God and the people. Okay, and that's all in a few sentences. I realize that is going to be the end of what I'll do in this podcast. I can't believe I've gone this long. But you'll see, maybe this is a good example of what we do in scholarship, and we like to argue with each other all the time. I'm sorry for this. And that's not to say every single thing Craig says in his book, I would pause every single time this degree, but I sure do when he brings in the New Testament. And of course in Mark's Gospel is more my specialty as well. Anyway, so I hope that's helpful to you in that. Maybe not. Maybe this is just despondent because you go, oh my goodness, I can never read it. I don't understand what he's talking about. But I guess maybe if there's any hope at all to help you is to say that this is the kind of stuff we do in scholarship, that we do, in fact, argue, but also that hopefully it will highlight to you the different ways Christians, well-intentioned Christians, do interpret the text differently. And one of the chief distinctions in this whole podcast I've tried to show is if you go to the text trying to keep it in this ancient context and without an overt agenda, it will change the way you interpret the text. And in the church these days, in my experience, frankly, outside of professors, every single preacher I've ever read that I can remember they've ever preached, they come at it as someone who's always trying to make it all fit together. And I think that usually means they rip it out of context and it's kind of smashing into a mold that doesn't fit. But again, it doesn't mean they can't ever do it. It just means I don't do that and I don't find it persuasive. And I think for us Christians, I think the best way to do it, though that can be good, I think the best way is, in fact, to read them independently and let them speak on their own. So if Mark wants to tell us what the significance of the death of Jesus is, and he wants to do it his way, without it being all about forgiving debt, the sin of people and his death, so be it. Let's hear what Mark has to say. Let's don't make Mark fit other people. That's my view, at least. But anyway, God bless you. If you haven't already, go check out reasonablefaith.org. Check out William Lane Craig. Listen to his lectures. Listen to his talks, his debates on YouTube. I mean, listen to he's got, 1 billion hours on YouTube, and it's outstanding. He'll give you a crash course on how to think critically and logically and consistently, and I think how to do it very well with people. He's just a kind gentleman, and I've met him once, have a picture with him, but that's it. And I really do hope he lives for another 50 years doing what he's doing. And let's pray for him and for those like him who are out there in the battlegrounds with people, skeptics and atheists, doing some really great work. And I'll see you next time. Well, the conversation isn't finished. You can always reach out to me on social media. Are you on Facebook? I am too. At Glimpse of the Kingdom. Glimpse of the Kingdom on Facebook. Be sure to like it and you can see updates there. Also, if you're on Twitter, check me out at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, or at Glimpse the King, and I try my best to respond to comments and questions on there as quickly as I can. If you want more, there are many more resources on the podcast and my blog. Go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and you can see a full list of the podcast, and my blog is available for free. Are you active in a church right now? I'd be happy to come out to your church and do all kinds of classes and workshops there. Check out davidpendergrass.com for more information. And may God in His great grace give you even just a glimpse of His kingdom this week. See you next time.